Heavy machinery tears into the earth at Van Hill Road. Tennessee investigators and FBI agents stand in a tight circle, their faces unreadable as dirt piles high under the grey sky. No cameras are allowed. No questions are answered. The only sound is the grinding of excavators cutting deeper into the ground, 9.5 miles from where 5-year-old Summer Wells vanished without a trace. This isn't the frantic search of those first desperate days back in June 2021. This is something else entirely. This is years later. This is calculated. This is the moment everything changed. For 3 years, the FBI said nothing. No press conferences, no updates, no answers. And then, without warning, they showed up at Van Hill Road with excavators and started digging. 9.5 miles from where Summer Wells vanished. No media allowed, no explanation given. But something was found. And the silence that followed told us more than any statement ever could. The public had been asking the same question since the beginning. Where are the feds? The FBI's involvement had been confirmed early on, mentioned in official statements and FAQs, but their presence was invisible. No FBI Most Wanted page, no federal reward plastered across the news, just silence. And in that silence, people assumed the worst. They assumed the case had gone cold. They assumed Summer had been forgotten. They were wrong, because on this day, at this remote location in Hawkins County, Tennessee, investigators weren't just searching, they were excavating. And excavation means something specific. It means you know where to look. It means you have information concrete enough to justify tearing up the ground. It means something led them here, something developed over years of quiet, invisible work that the public never saw. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this case is far from over, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment and let me know. Where are you watching from? The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation would later describe it in the most careful, deliberate language possible, following up on a lead. But those 4 words don't capture the weight of what happened here. They don't explain why investigators returned to this case years after the initial searches turned up nothing. They don't tell you what changed. And they certainly don't tell you what was discovered beneath the soil at Van Hill Road. The Van Hill Road excavation wasn't random. It wasn't a hunch. It was the result of something investigators had been building toward for years, quietly, methodically, and completely out of public view. And if you want to understand what really happened to Summer Wells, you have to start here, at this moment, when the silence finally broke and the investigation took a turn nobody saw coming. The 15th of June 2021, Hawkins County, Tennessee. A place where everyone knows everyone, where roads wind through thick woods and homes sit tucked back from the main highway, isolated and quiet. It's rural America in every sense, the kind of place where kids still play outside unsupervised, where neighbors are few and far between, and where a scream for help might not reach anyone at all. Summer Wells was 5 years old. Blonde hair, bright blue eyes, the kind of little girl who should have had her whole life ahead of her. She lived with her parents, Don and Candace Wells, and her 3 brothers in a home that sat on Ben Hill Road, surrounded by dense Tennessee wilderness. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood where you worry about strangers. It was the kind of place where danger, if it came, would come from somewhere much closer. On that Tuesday afternoon, Summer was playing outside. Her mother, Candace, said she went into the house for a moment, and when she came back out, Summer was gone. Just like that. No screams. No struggle, no sign of where she went. One moment she was there, and the next, she wasn't. The Amber Alert went out fast. Summer Moon Utah Wells, 5 years old. Last seen wearing grey pants and a pink shirt. Blonde hair, blue eyes, 3 feet tall, 40 pounds. The alert spread across Tennessee and into neighboring states. Phones buzzed, news stations interrupted programming, social media exploded, and within hours, Hawkins County was flooded with law enforcement. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping through the humid summer air. K-9 units combed the woods, noses to the ground, searching for any trace of her scent. Volunteers poured in from surrounding counties, strangers who had never met Summer but couldn't stand the thought of a little girl lost in the wilderness. They walked grid patterns through the trees, calling her name, hoping for a response that never came. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation took the lead. Local sheriff's deputies coordinated with state authorities, and quietly, behind the scenes, the FBI began their involvement. It was mentioned in press releases, acknowledged in official statements, but never explained. The feds were there, but you wouldn't know it by looking. Real quick, what time is it where you are right now? I want to know how far Summer's story has reached. Drop it in the comments. As the hours turned into days, the focus began to shift. Searches expanded, but so did the scrutiny. In cases like this, investigators always start close to home. Statistically, when a child goes missing, the answer is usually found within the family or someone the family knows. It's an uncomfortable truth, but it's a truth nonetheless. And in the Wells family, there were questions, a lot of them. Don Wells, Summer's father, became a focal point almost immediately. He wasn't home when Summer disappeared, he was at work. But his past raised red flags. He had a criminal history, prior charges that made people wonder. He was outspoken, defensive, and as the days went on, his behavior started to draw attention for all the wrong reasons. People described him as angry, not just grieving, but hostile. Big mad, as some would later put it. Candace Wells, Summer's mother, faced her own wave of suspicion. She was the last person to see Summer alive. Her timeline was scrutinized. Her statements were picked apart. Online sleuths dissected every interview she gave, every word she said, looking for inconsistencies, contradictions, anything that might point to guilt. The internet can be ruthless, and in this case, it was merciless. Then there were the theories. Abduction by a stranger, an accident covered up by the family, involvement by someone close to the home. Rumors swirled about visitors to the property that day, about timelines that didn't quite add up, about a lifestyle that some people judged harshly. The Wells family lived modestly, some would say poorly. Their home wasn't pristine, their lives weren't perfect, and in the court of public opinion, that was enough to convict them before any evidence ever surfaced. But here's the thing, theories aren't evidence, suspicion isn't proof. And despite the intense focus on the family, despite the searches that covered miles of rugged terrain, despite the hundreds of tips that poured in from across the country, nothing was found. No body, no clothing, no sign of Summer Wells. The initial search efforts were massive. They covered the woods surrounding the home, the roads leading in and out of the area, nearby bodies of water, abandoned structures. They used drones, thermal imaging, cadaver dogs. They interviewed neighbors, family members, anyone who might have seen something, heard something, known something, and they came up empty. Weeks passed. The helicopters stopped flying, the volunteers went home, the news cameras packed up and moved on to the next tragedy. And slowly, painfully, the case began to fade from the headlines. And then, the case went quiet. Too quiet. The FBI didn't hold press conferences, the TBI stopped releasing updates, the family stopped doing interviews. The official line was always the same. The investigation is ongoing. But to the outside world, it looked like nothing was happening. It looked like Summer Wells had been forgotten. Another missing child who slipped through the cracks. Another face on a poster that would eventually fade and peel away. But that silence, as it turns out, didn't mean what people thought it meant. Months passed. Then a year. Then 2. Then 3. And with each passing season, the silence around Summer Wells grew heavier. The media moved on, the daily updates stopped, the search parties disbanded, the helicopters never came back, and for those watching from the outside, it felt like the world had simply forgotten about a 5-year-old girl who vanished from her own backyard. No arrests were made, no suspects were publicly named, no press conferences were held to announce breakthroughs or setbacks. The official statements, when they came at all, were maddeningly vague. The investigation is ongoing. We continue to follow leads. Anyone with information is encouraged to come forward. The same lines, over and over, until they stopped meaning anything at all, and the public grew frustrated, angry even. Because in the age of true crime documentaries and 24-hour news cycles, we've been conditioned to expect answers. We expect drama. We expect resolution. We expect to see investigators working, to hear officials speaking, to witness progress in real time. And when none of that happens, when the cameras go dark and the updates stop, the assumption is always the same. They gave up. The question that haunted the case more than any other was this: where are the feds? It became a rallying cry on social media, a hashtag, a demand. Where are the feds? People pointed to the early statements from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, confirming that the FBI had been involved since the Amber Alert phase. They pointed to references in official FAQs that mentioned federal resources, technical support, analytical assistance. The FBI was supposed to be helping. So where were they? There was no FBI Most Wanted page for Summer Wells, no federal reward announced to incentivize tips, no FBI spokesperson standing at a podium outlining the investigation's priorities or progress. Everything the public knew about federal involvement came filtered through state-level agencies, and even that information was sparse, indirect, and frustratingly incomplete. In other high-profile missing child cases, the FBI's presence is unmistakable. Their branding is everywhere. You see the blue and gold logo on press releases. You hear agents speaking directly to the media. You see rewards posted, national bulletins issued, resources deployed in ways that are visible and reassuring. The message is clear. We are here, we are working, and we will not stop until this child is found. But in the Summer Wells case, none of that happened, and the absence of those familiar signals led people to one conclusion: the feds aren't really involved, or if they are, they don't care enough to show it. Comparisons were inevitable. People pointed to other missing children who received the full federal treatment. Sebastian Rogers, a teenager who went missing in Tennessee, had an FBI page. He had a federally announced reward. His case was amplified through national channels. So why didn't Summer Wells get the same attention? Why did her case look so different? The implied answer, the one that made people furious, was that Summer's life mattered less. That because of who her family was, where they lived, how they looked, she didn't warrant the same level of effort. It felt like a judgment. It felt like abandonment. But here's what most people don't understand about missing child cases. Visibility is not the same thing as effort. A press conference is not the same thing as progress. And the absence of public-facing federal tools does not mean the FBI isn't working. It means they're working differently. The FBI operates under strict jurisdictional rules. Unless there's evidence of a federal crime, interstate kidnapping, human trafficking across state lines, or another qualifying offense, the FBI doesn't have independent authority to take over a case. They can assist, they can provide resources, they can analyze data, offer behavioral assessments, deploy technical specialists, but they can't lead. Jurisdiction stays with local or state authorities. In this case, that meant Tennessee. This is called the cooperation model, and it's far more common than people realize. In these cases, the FBI's role is support, not command. And support, by its very nature, is often invisible. Analysts review tips in windowless offices. Specialists consult on digital evidence without ever appearing on camera. Databases are cross-referenced. Patterns are evaluated. None of that makes headlines. None of that reassures the public. But it's happening. The decision not to deploy public-facing tools, no FBI page, no federal reward, isn't a reflection of how much investigators care. It's a strategic calculation. Those tools are used when investigators believe that broad public engagement will generate actionable information. When they don't believe that, when they think the critical information is concentrated within a specific network of people, locations, or timelines, those tools are withheld. Not out of neglect, but out of precision. In some cases, going public helps. In others, it creates noise. Tips flood in, but most of them are useless. Resources get diverted, chasing down rumors, conspiracy theories, and well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful leads. In a case already saturated with online speculation, adding a federal reward could make things worse, not better. So the question isn't, why didn't the FBI help Summer Wells the way they helped other kids? The question is, what did investigators know about this case that made them choose a different strategy? Be honest. Did you think this case had gone cold? Let me know in the comments. Behind the scenes, while the public saw nothing, the investigation was evolving. It had to be, because cases don't stay static. Information continues to come in. Witnesses change their stories. New technology allows old evidence to be re-examined. Relationships shift. People who were once loyal become willing to talk. And investigators, the good ones, never stop evaluating. The silence wasn't abandonment, it was focus. The investigation had moved from the broad, desperate phase of those first days, helicopters and volunteers and grid searches, into something narrower. Something more deliberate, the kind of work that doesn't announce itself because announcing it would compromise everything. This is the part the public doesn't see. The tip evaluations, the cross-referencing of timelines, the quiet re-interviews with people who were spoken to years earlier, the digital forensics that take months to process, the behavioral analysis that tries to build a profile of what happened, who was involved, and why. None of that is visible, none of that is dramatic. But it's the foundation of every solved case. And in the Summer Wells investigation, something was building, slowly, quietly. Outside the view of cameras and commentators and online sleuths, information was being developed. Leads were being followed. The FBI's involvement, invisible as it was, had never stopped. Analysts were still working. Data was still being reviewed. And at some point, all of that work pointed investigators toward a single location. Van Hill Road, 9.5 miles from where Summer Wells disappeared. A place that meant nothing to the public but everything to the investigation. The excavation that would eventually take place there wasn't a random search. It wasn't a hunch. It wasn't investigators throwing darts at a map hoping to get lucky. It was the result of years of work. Work that no one saw, work that no one could see, because the moment you announce what you're looking at, you risk losing it. This is why the silence mattered. Not because nothing was happening, but because everything was happening in a way that required absolute control over information flow. Investigators couldn't afford leaks. They couldn't afford to tip off anyone connected to the case. They couldn't afford to let the public, or the media, or anyone outside the investigative team know what they were building toward. So they said nothing, and the public interpreted that silence as failure. But silence, in an investigation like this, is often the opposite. It's discipline. It's patience. It's the refusal to sacrifice long-term success for short-term reassurance. And in the Summer Wells case, that silence was about to break in a way no one expected. Because while the world thought this case had gone cold, investigators were preparing to dig. It was late 2023, more than 2 years after Summer Wells vanished, when investigators returned to Hawkins County. Not with volunteers, not with search dogs, not with the frantic energy of those first desperate days. This time, they came with excavators. The location was Van Hill Road, a rural stretch of land about 9.5 miles from the Wells family home on Ben Hill Road. To anyone unfamiliar with the case, it would have seemed like just another piece of Tennessee countryside, wooded, quiet, unremarkable. But to investigators, this place meant something significant enough to justify bringing in heavy machinery, something concrete enough to cordon off the area and keep the media at a distance, something serious enough that the FBI, invisible for years, was right there alongside the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation as the digging began. This wasn't a search in the traditional sense. Searches are broad, they cover ground, they look for anything that might be relevant. This was an excavation, and excavation is different. Excavation means you know where to look. It means you have information, specific, credible, actionable information that tells you something is there, or was there, or happened there. You don't bring in that kind of equipment. You don't commit that level of resources. You don't draw that kind of attention unless you've crossed a threshold, unless you have a lead that's strong enough to act on. The public didn't know it was happening until it was already underway. There were no advance announcements, no press conferences to explain what investigators were doing or why. Law enforcement vehicles lined the road. Yellow tape marked the perimeter. Officers stood guard, turning away anyone who wasn't authorized to be there. No media allowed, no questions answered. Just the sound of machinery tearing into the earth and the sight of investigators standing in tight clusters, watching, waiting, evaluating. And then came the statement, brief, controlled, maddeningly vague. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation confirmed that they were conducting a search in connection with the Summer Wells case. They described it as following up on a lead. That was it. No elaboration, no details, no explanation of what the lead was, where it came from, or what they hoped to find. Following up on a lead. 4 words that told the public almost nothing but told investigators everything. Because here's the reality. This wasn't a hunch. This wasn't investigators grasping at straws or revisiting old ground out of desperation. This was targeted. This was deliberate. And this was the result of information that had been developed over years of quiet, invisible work. Work that involved the FBI, even if their role was never publicly acknowledged. Work that involved analysts poring over data, cross-referencing timelines, re-evaluating witness statements, and building a picture of what happened to Summer Wells that the public never saw. Van Hill Road is 9.5 miles from the Wells home. That distance matters. It's not next door. It's not within the immediate radius of those first frantic searches, but it's not remote either. It's close enough to fall within the range of routine local movement, close enough that someone familiar with the area, someone who lived there, worked there, or had connections there, could have accessed it without raising suspicion. Close enough to be significant. The terrain itself is typical of rural Tennessee, wooded, hilly, the kind of place where you could hide something, or someone, and it might not be found for years. The kind of place where the ground keeps secrets. And on this day, investigators believed the ground at Van Hill Road was holding one of those secrets. The excavation wasn't surface level. This wasn't a matter of walking the area with metal detectors or raking through leaves. They were digging, deep, methodically. The kind of digging that suggests investigators knew, or strongly suspected, that something had been buried, that something had been concealed, that whatever they were looking for wasn't going to be found by casual observation. It required effort, it required precision, and it required the kind of information that doesn't come from tips called into a hotline. It comes from investigation. So what led them there? The official answer is the one the TBI gave, a lead. But that word, lead, covers a lot of ground. A lead could be a witness statement. It could be a confession, full or partial. It could be digital evidence, phone records, GPS data, something that placed a person or a vehicle at that location around the time Summer disappeared. It could be forensic analysis that pointed investigators in a new direction. It could be the result of behavioral profiling, analysts determining that if something happened to Summer, this is the kind of place where evidence would most likely be. Or it could be a combination of all of those things. Investigations don't usually hinge on a single piece of information. They hinge on the accumulation of data, the slow building of a case where individual pieces, none of them conclusive on their own, start to form a pattern. And when that pattern becomes strong enough, when the threshold of probable cause is met, investigators act. The fact that this excavation happened years after Summer's disappearance tells us something important. It tells us that the information guiding investigators to Van Hill Road wasn't available early on. Either it was newly obtained, someone came forward, someone changed their story, someone broke their silence, or it was newly understood. Sometimes investigations don't advance because new evidence appears. They advance because old evidence is seen in a new light. A statement that seemed irrelevant in 2021 might look very different in 2023 when placed alongside other information. A timeline that didn't make sense initially might suddenly click into place when cross-referenced with digital records or witness accounts. This is the kind of work the FBI excels at, not the dramatic, Hollywood version of federal agents kicking down doors and making arrests. The quiet version, the analytical version, the version where specialists sit in offices and build timelines, map relationships, identify inconsistencies, and generate investigative leads that state and local authorities can act on. That's what FBI assistance looks like in a cooperation case, and that's almost certainly what led investigators to Van Hill Road. The excavation lasted for days, maybe longer. The exact timeline was never made public, and that's intentional. The less the public knows about the specifics, the less potential suspects know. The less they can prepare, the less they can destroy evidence or coordinate stories. Silence, in this phase of an investigation, is a weapon. It keeps the advantage with law enforcement. But the silence also fueled speculation. Online communities exploded with theories. People analyzed satellite images of Van Hill Road, trying to figure out exactly where the digging was taking place. They debated what might have been found. They pointed fingers at individuals they believed were responsible, often with no evidence beyond suspicion and rumor. The internet, as it always does, filled the information vacuum with noise, and through it all, investigators said nothing. No confirmation of what was found, no denial that anything was found, no clarification of whether the excavation was successful or whether it ruled out a theory. Just the same carefully worded statement: "We are following up on a lead in connection with the disappearance of Summer Wells. The investigation is ongoing." That silence is strategic, but it's also necessary. Because even if investigators found something at Van Hill Road, and the fact that they were digging suggests they believed they would, announcing it publicly could jeopardize everything that comes next. If evidence was recovered, it has to be analyzed. Chain of custody has to be maintained. Forensic testing takes time. And if that evidence points to a specific individual, investigators need to build a case that will hold up in court. Announcing findings prematurely could give a defense attorney ammunition to challenge the integrity of the investigation. It could spook witnesses. It could cause someone to flee or destroy additional evidence. So the silence continues, not because nothing happened, but because something did. And whatever that something was, it was significant enough to justify the excavation in the first place. Here's what we know for certain. The Van Hill Road excavation was not random. It was based on information developed through investigative work that involved the FBI. It occurred years after Summer's disappearance, which means the case never went cold. It evolved. It was targeted and deliberate, which means investigators had reason to believe this location was relevant. And it was kept as quiet as possible, which means whatever they were looking for, or whatever they found, is still part of an active investigation. What we don't know is just as important. We don't know what specific information led investigators to Van Hill Road. We don't know if physical evidence was recovered. We don't know if the excavation confirmed or ruled out a theory. We don't know if it brought investigators closer to an arrest or if it opened up new questions. And we don't know how this location connects to the broader timeline of Summer's disappearance. But the fact that it happened at all tells us something critical. It tells us that the investigation into Summer Wells' disappearance is not stagnant. It's not abandoned. It's not a case that's been filed away and forgotten. It's active, it's moving, and it's being worked by investigators who believe they can find answers, even if those answers take years to uncover. Van Hill Road changed the narrative. For years, the public believed this case had gone cold. They believed the FBI had walked away. They believed Summer had been forgotten. The excavation proved all of that wrong. It proved that investigators were still working, still following leads, still building towards something. And it proved that the silence, as frustrating and painful as it was, wasn't emptiness. It was discipline. Because somewhere in the data, in the timelines, in the witness statements, and the forensic analysis, and the behavioral profiles, investigators found something that pointed them to this place. And whatever that something was, it was strong enough to bring them back to Hawkins County with excavators and federal agents and a determination to dig until they found what they were looking for. The question now isn't whether investigators are working the case. The question is what they found when they started digging, and whether what they found will finally bring answers to a family that's been waiting, and a little girl who's been missing for far too long. They found something. That much is clear. You don't bring excavators to a remote location, dig for days, and then walk away without comment unless something was recovered or confirmed. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation hasn't said it outright, but the structure of their silence, the way they've handled the aftermath of the Van Hill Road excavation, tells the story their words won't. A clue was found. And that clue changed everything. But here's where it gets complicated and frustrating and deeply painful for anyone who's been following this case. We know something was discovered. We know it was significant. We know it was connected to years of investigative work. What we don't know is what it was. Was it physical evidence? Clothing? Personal items? Something that belonged to Summer? Was it forensic material? Something that could be tested for DNA? Something that could link a person to a place or a timeline? Was it confirmation of witness testimony? Proof that someone's story was true or false? Was it something buried? Something hidden? Something that had been concealed for years and was finally brought into the light? We don't know. And the TBI isn't telling us. The official statements following the excavation have been as vague as the ones that came before it. The investigation is ongoing. We continue to follow leads. Anyone with information is encouraged to come forward. The same language, the same careful phrasing, the same refusal to provide details that might satisfy the public's desperate need to know. And that refusal, that silence, has driven people to the edge of frustration. Because this isn't just a case. This is a little girl. This is a family that's been waiting for answers for years. This is a community that's been haunted by the question of what happened on that June day in 2021. And when investigators finally do something visible, when they finally take action that suggests progress and then refuse to explain what that progress means, It feels like cruelty. Just tell us what you found. That's the demand echoing across social media, in comment sections, in true crime forums. Just tell us. We've waited long enough. We deserve to know. Summer deserves for the truth to come out. But here's the reality. As hard as it is to accept, disclosure could destroy the case. Now, I know you want answers, but here's why silence might actually be a good sign. When investigators find evidence in a case like this, especially evidence that's been concealed or buried, the first priority isn't public reassurance, it's preservation. Evidence has to be documented, photographed, catalogued. Chain of custody has to be established and maintained without any break, any gap, any opportunity for a defense attorney to argue contamination or mishandling. If something was recovered from Van Hill Road, it's likely in a forensic lab right now, being analyzed with a level of precision and care that takes time. Weeks, sometimes months. And during that time, investigators can't talk about it, because talking about it, even in general terms, could compromise everything. Let's say, hypothetically, that investigators found an item of clothing. If they announce that publicly, even without specifying what the item is, they've just told everyone connected to the case that physical evidence exists. And if there's a suspect, someone who knows what happened to Summer, that announcement could trigger a response. It could cause that person to destroy other evidence. It could cause them to flee. It could cause them to coordinate with others who might be involved, aligning stories, creating alibis, making it harder to build a prosecutable case. Or let's say investigators found something that confirms a witness's statement. If they announce that, they've just validated that witness publicly. And if that witness is in danger, if they're living in a community where speaking to law enforcement could put them at risk, that announcement could have devastating consequences. Witnesses in cases like this don't always come forward out of courage. Sometimes they come forward out of fear, or guilt, or a slow-building realization that staying silent is worse than speaking up. Protecting those witnesses means protecting their anonymity, and that requires silence. There's also the legal reality. Anything investigators say publicly becomes part of the record. It can be used in court. It can be challenged. It can be twisted. Defense attorneys are skilled at taking statements made during investigations and using them to create reasonable doubt. A single, careless phrase, a single premature disclosure can be the difference between a conviction and an acquittal. Investigators know this. Prosecutors know this. And so they say nothing until they're absolutely certain that speaking won't jeopardize the case they're trying to build. But none of that makes it easier for the people who are waiting. For Summer's family, if they're not involved, the silence is torture. For the community, it's exhausting. For those of us watching from the outside, it feels like we're being kept in the dark for no reason. We want closure. We want justice. We want to know that the system is working, that the people in charge are doing their jobs, that Summer hasn't been forgotten. And the truth is, all of those things can be true. The system can be working, investigators can be doing their jobs, Summer can be at the center of everything they're doing, and we still won't be told what's happening. Because investigations aren't conducted for public consumption. They're conducted to find truth and build cases. And sometimes, those two goals require secrecy. The implications of the Van Hill Road excavation are significant, even without knowing exactly what was found. The fact that it happened at all tells us several things. First, the clue, whatever it is, was significant enough to justify the resources, the time, the manpower, and the risk of public attention that comes with an excavation. Investigators don't do this lightly. They don't dig up rural Tennessee on a whim. They do it because they have information that crosses a threshold, information that's credible, specific, and actionable. Second, this clue was connected to information developed over years. The excavation didn't happen in the immediate aftermath of Summer's disappearance. It happened years later. That means the lead that brought investigators to Van Hill Road wasn't something they had in 2021. It was something that emerged over time through the slow, painstaking work of building timelines, re-interviewing witnesses, analyzing data, and connecting dots that weren't visible at first. Third, this clue changed the direction of the case. You don't excavate a site unless you believe it's going to move the investigation forward, whether that means confirming a theory, ruling out alternatives, or opening up new avenues of inquiry. The Van Hill Road excavation was a turning point. It marked a shift from the broad, uncertain phase of the investigation into something more focused, something more targeted. And fourth, the silence that followed the excavation suggests that whatever was found is still being evaluated. If the excavation had turned up nothing, if it had been a dead end, investigators might have said so. Not definitively, but in a way that signaled the lead didn't pan out. The fact that they haven't done that, the fact that the language remains carefully neutral, suggests that the clue is still active. It's still part of the investigation. It's still being worked. But here's the part that's hardest to sit with. We may never know what the clue is. Not until there's an arrest. Not until there's a trial. Not until the case reaches a point where disclosure is legally required or strategically beneficial. And if the case never reaches that point, if the clue leads to more questions instead of answers, if the investigation continues to evolve without resolution, we may be left in this same place of uncertainty for years to come. That's the reality of cases like this. They don't follow the neat, three-act structure of a true crime documentary. They don't resolve on a timeline that satisfies our need for closure. They unfold slowly, messily, and often in ways that are invisible to everyone except the people doing the work. And for Summer's family, that's unbearable. If they're innocent, if they had nothing to do with her disappearance, they're living in a nightmare that has no end. Every day without answers is another day of not knowing whether their daughter is alive or dead, whether she's suffering or at peace, whether the person responsible will ever be held accountable. The excavation at Van Hill Road might have given investigators a clue, but it didn't give the family closure. And closure is what they need most. For the community, the silence is a wound that won't heal. Hawkins County is a small place. People know each other. They see each other at the grocery store, at church, at school events. And somewhere in that community, someone knows what happened to Summer Wells. Maybe they were involved. Maybe they saw something. Maybe they heard something. And the fact that no arrest has been made, that no one has been publicly named, means that person is still there, still walking around, still living their life while a little girl is gone. The public frustration is real, and it's valid. We want answers. We want justice. We want to believe that when a child goes missing, the system moves heaven and earth to find them and hold the responsible parties accountable. And when that doesn't happen visibly, when the work is done behind closed doors and we're told nothing, it feels like failure. But silence isn't always failure. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's the only way to protect the integrity of an investigation that's still moving forward. And sometimes, as painful as it is, silence is the price of getting it right. The clue found at Van Hill Road matters. It matters to investigators, it matters to the case, and it matters to Summer. Even if we never know what it is, even if the details remain locked away in evidence rooms and case files, that clue is part of the path toward truth. And truth, however long it takes to uncover, is what Summer Wells deserves. A clue is not a body, it's not an arrest, it's not a confession that wraps everything up in a neat bow and gives us the closure we're desperate for. A clue is a piece of the puzzle. And in a case as complex and murky as Summer Wells's disappearance, every piece matters, even if we can't see the full picture yet. So what could this clue be? What kind of evidence would justify an excavation at Van Hill Road years after Summer vanished? It could be physical evidence, clothing that matches what Summer was wearing the day she disappeared, a personal item, a toy, a shoe, something small but unmistakably hers. It could be forensic material, soil samples, biological evidence, something that can be tested for DNA and potentially linked to a person, a vehicle, or a specific location. Physical evidence is powerful because it's tangible. It can be analyzed. It can be presented in court. It can connect dots that witness testimony alone never could. Or it could be confirmation of witness testimony. Maybe someone came forward, months or years after the fact, and told investigators something that pointed them toward Van Hill Road. Maybe that person described the location, described what happened there, described who was involved, and maybe investigators needed to verify that testimony before they could act on it. Excavating the site could have been a way to test whether the witness was telling the truth. If they said something was buried there and investigators found it, that's not just evidence about Summer. That's evidence about the credibility of the witness. And credible witnesses are the foundation of prosecutable cases. The clue could also represent the elimination of alternative theories. Investigations don't just build cases, they also rule things out. Maybe there were multiple theories about what happened to Summer, multiple possible locations, multiple potential suspects. The Van Hill Road excavation could have been designed to confirm or eliminate one of those theories. If investigators found what they were looking for, it narrows the focus. If they didn't, it redirects resources toward other possibilities. Either way, it's progress. Or the clue could be a connection to a person who had access to Van Hill Road, a connection to a vehicle that was seen in the area around the time Summer disappeared, a connection to a timeline that places someone at that location when they claim to be somewhere else. Connections are what turn suspicions into evidence. They're what allow investigators to say, this person was here, at this time, and here's proof. What's the weather like where you are today? I know it's random, but I want to feel connected to everyone watching this. Drop it below. The distance matters. Van Hill Road is 9.5 miles from the Wells family home. That's not next door, but it's not remote either. It's within the radius of local movement. It's the kind of distance someone could cover in 10-15 minutes by car. It's close enough that someone familiar with the area, someone who lived in Hawkins County, worked there, had family there, could have accessed it without raising suspicion. And that's significant, because it suggests that whoever is responsible for Summer's disappearance, if this location is connected to her case, wasn't a stranger passing through. It was someone local, someone who knew the area, someone who knew where to go to avoid being seen, someone who had access to this specific piece of land, whether through ownership, familiarity, or opportunity. Van Hill Road isn't a random spot on a map. It's a place that meant something to someone. And investigators believe that someone is connected to Summer Wells. This could tie back to family. It could tie back to acquaintances, friends, neighbors, people who were in and out of the Wells home. It could tie back to local networks, people who knew people, who had connections that aren't immediately obvious but become clear when you map out relationships and movements. Rural communities are like that. Everyone is connected in some way. And those connections, invisible to outsiders, are exactly what investigators spend years untangling. The timing matters just as much as the distance. This excavation didn't happen in June 2021. It didn't happen in the immediate aftermath of Summer's disappearance, when search efforts were at their peak. It happened years later. And that tells us something critical. The information that led investigators to Van Hill Road wasn't available at the beginning. It took time to develop. Maybe a witness came forward late. Maybe someone who was too scared to talk in 2021 finally found the courage or the motivation to speak up in 2023. Maybe someone's loyalty shifted. Maybe a relationship broke down, a friendship ended, a family member decided they couldn't carry the secret anymore. People don't always come forward right away. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes the weight of guilt or fear, or the realization that staying silent makes them complicit. Or maybe the information came from digital analysis, phone records, GPS data, social media activity, financial transactions. The kind of data that takes months to subpoena, process, and analyze. The kind of data that doesn't reveal its significance until it's cross-referenced with other information. Digital forensics is slow, meticulous work, but it's also incredibly powerful. It can place people in locations they claimed they never were. It can reveal communications they said never happened. It can build timelines that contradict the stories people told investigators years earlier. Or maybe it was pattern recognition. Maybe analysts, working quietly in the background, noticed something. A connection that wasn't obvious at first. A name that kept appearing in different contexts. A location that showed up in multiple witness statements. A behavior that fit a profile. The FBI excels at this kind of work. They have databases, tools, and expertise that local agencies don't. And in a cooperation case, that's exactly what they provide. Not the spotlight, not the press conferences, but the analysis that turns scattered information into actionable leads. The excavation itself matters. This wasn't a surface-level search. This wasn't investigators walking the area with metal detectors or raking through leaves hoping to spot something. They were digging, deep, methodically, with heavy equipment designed to move earth and uncover what's been hidden. That tells us something was buried or concealed. And it tells us investigators knew where to dig. They didn't show up at Van Hill Road and start excavating randomly. They had a target. They had coordinates, a specific area, a reason to believe that this exact spot held something relevant to Summer's case. That level of precision doesn't come from guesswork. It comes from information. Detailed, credible, specific information. This was precision, not speculation. And precision, in an investigation like this, is everything. It's the difference between a search that turns up nothing and a search that changes the entire trajectory of a case. It's the difference between investigators chasing shadows and investigators closing in on the truth. Every clue brings investigators closer. That's the reality of how cases are solved, not with one dramatic breakthrough, but with the slow accumulation of evidence. Each piece, on its own, might not be enough. But together, they form a picture. They build a case. They create a foundation strong enough to support an arrest, a charge, a prosecution. And every day matters, because the longer a case goes unsolved, the harder it becomes. Memories fade, witnesses move away, evidence degrades, relationships change. The window for justice gets narrower. But the Van Hill Road excavation proves that window hasn't closed. Not yet. Investigators are still working. They're still building. They're still moving toward something. The clue found at Van Hill Road, whatever it is, represents progress. It represents years of work finally producing something tangible. It represents the possibility, however distant, that Somerwell's case might one day be solved. And for a family that's been waiting, for a community that's been haunted, for everyone who's followed this case and refused to let Summer be forgotten, that possibility is everything. Because a clue isn't just a piece of evidence. It's hope. It's proof that the investigation is alive. It's a signal that someone, somewhere, is still fighting for a little girl who can't fight for herself. And in a case defined by silence and uncertainty, that signal matters more than anything. The Van Hill Road clue was tied to FBI-assisted work. That much has been acknowledged, carefully and indirectly, in the statements surrounding the excavation. But here's what didn't happen. The FBI never held a press conference. They never issued a statement. They never stood in front of cameras and took credit for the lead that brought investigators to that location. Their role, as it has been from the beginning, remained invisible. And this is where the case gets really interesting, because the public has spent years asking, where are the feds? They've pointed to the absence of FBI branding, the lack of federal rewards, the silence from federal agents, and concluded that the FBI wasn't really involved. Or if they weren't doing anything meaningful. The Van Hill Road excavation proves that conclusion was wrong. Dead wrong. The FBI was there the whole time. You just couldn't see them. This is how the cooperation model works. And understanding it is essential to understanding why this case has looked the way it has for the past 3 years. In a cooperation case, the FBI doesn't lead. They assist. Jurisdiction stays with state or local authorities. In this case, that's the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office. Those agencies are in charge. They make the decisions, they control the messaging, they determine what gets said publicly and what stays internal. The FBI's role is to provide resources, expertise, and support, but they do it behind the scenes. Federal analysts review tips. They cross-reference data. They run information through national databases that local agencies don't have access to. Behavioral specialists consult on suspect profiles, victimology, and investigative strategy. Technical experts assist with digital forensics, communications analysis, and evidence processing. All of that work is critical. All of it moves the investigation forward. But none of it is public-facing. Public communication stays with state agencies. When the TBI issues a statement, they're speaking for the entire investigative team, including the FBI. When they say we are following up on a lead, that we includes federal resources. But the FBI doesn't step forward to clarify their role. They don't need to. Their job isn't public relations, it's investigation. This explains the years of silence. It explains why there was no FBI Most Wanted page, no federal reward, no press conferences with agents in blue windbreakers standing behind a podium. It wasn't because the FBI didn't care. It wasn't because they walked away. It was because their role, by design, doesn't require visibility. In fact, in many cases, visibility would be counterproductive. When the FBI operates quietly, they preserve flexibility. They avoid tipping off suspects. They protect sources. They keep the investigative strategy internal, where it can't be picked apart by defense attorneys or exploited by people connected to the case. Silence, in this context, isn't a failure of communication, it's a deliberate tactical choice, and the Van Hill Road excavation proves it worked. Federal involvement was real, active, and effective. The lead that brought investigators to that location, the information that justified digging up rural Tennessee years after Summer disappeared, came from work that involved the FBI. Their analysts, their databases, their expertise. It was there, shaping the investigation, even when no one could see it. Look, if you're still here, you're not just watching a video, you're part of keeping Summer's story alive. Share this with someone who cares. Hit that subscribe button, because cases like this don't get solved by silence, they get solved by people who refuse to forget. This is why comparisons to other cases where the FBI was front and center, are misleading. Those cases required a different strategy. Maybe the suspect pool was national. Maybe there was evidence of interstate activity. Maybe public engagement was likely to generate useful tips. In those cases, visibility made sense. In Summer's case, it didn't. And that's not a judgment on her worth, it's a judgment on investigative strategy. The FBI made a calculation. They determined that this case required precision, not publicity. They determined that the answers were likely to come from within a concentrated network of people, not from a nationwide tip line. They determined that quiet, methodical work would be more effective than loud, public appeals. And based on what happened at Van Hill Road, it looks like they were right. The cooperation model isn't perfect. It frustrates the public. It denies families the reassurance of seeing federal agents visibly working their case. It creates a perception of inaction when the reality is the opposite. But it's also effective. It allows investigations to proceed without interference. It protects sensitive information, and it produces results, even if those results take years to materialize. The FBI's invisible hand has been guiding this investigation from the beginning, quietly, carefully, without fanfare or recognition. And now, with the Van Hill Road excavation, that guidance has produced something tangible, a clue, a lead, a step forward in a case that many people believed had stalled. The feds were always there. You just had to know where to look, and more importantly, you had to understand that their absence from the spotlight didn't mean they were absent from the work. It meant they were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, supporting state authorities, providing expertise, and helping build a case that might, one day, bring justice for Summer Wells. As the investigation narrowed, as the broad searches gave way to targeted analysis, behavior became data. Not evidence in the legal sense, but information. Signals. Patterns that investigators catalog, evaluate, and try to understand. And in the Summer Wells case, one person's behavior drew more attention than anyone else's. Don Wells, Summer's father. Don was described, by people who encountered him in the months and years after Summer disappeared, as big, mad, not just grieving, not just devastated, angry, visibly, vocally, intensely angry. And that anger manifested in ways that raised questions, that created contradictions, that made people wonder what was really going on beneath the surface. One incident, in particular, became a focal point. It was reported that Don Wells ripped up missing person posters of Summer at a public event, tore them down, destroyed them, the very tools meant to keep his daughter's face in the public eye, to generate tips, to remind people that she was still missing and still mattered. He allegedly ripped them apart. Now, before you jump to conclusions, let me explain why this matters to investigators. First, let's be clear. This is reported behavior, not confirmed fact. We weren't there. We didn't see it happen. What we have are accounts from people who claim they witnessed it, accounts that spread through the community and online. Whether it happened exactly as described, whether there's context we're missing, whether the story has been exaggerated or distorted through retelling, we don't know. So we have to frame this carefully. This isn't about stating facts, it's about examining the contradiction and what it might mean. Because if it did happen, if Don Wells did tear down his daughter's missing person posters, the question is obvious. Why? Why would a father destroy the tools meant to find his child? Why would someone who claims to want answers actively work against the visibility that could generate those answers? There are explanations that don't involve guilt, and investigators, the good ones, consider all of them. Displaced anger under trauma is real. Grief doesn't always look like sadness, sometimes it looks like rage. When you lose someone, especially when you lose them in a way that makes no sense, that offers no closure, that leaves you suspended in a nightmare you can't wake up from, anger becomes an outlet. It's easier to be angry than to sit with the helplessness. It's easier to lash out than to collapse. And sometimes that anger gets directed at things that don't make logical sense. At posters, at reporters, at people trying to help. Not because you don't want help, but because the anger has to go somewhere and you've run out of appropriate targets. Then there's reputational defense. From the moment Summer disappeared, Don Wells was under suspicion. The internet convicted him before investigators ever named him as a person of interest. His past was dug up, analyzed, weaponized. His criminal history, his behavior, his appearance, everything about him was used as evidence of guilt in the court of public opinion. And when you're living under that kind of scrutiny, when every word you say is twisted, every action is interpreted as proof of something sinister, you start to see the missing person posters differently. They're not just about finding Summer, they're about keeping the case in the spotlight. And the spotlight, for Don, meant more accusations, more judgment, more people pointing fingers at him instead of looking for his daughter. Ripping down the posters could have been an act of frustration, a way of saying, these aren't helping, these are just keeping me in the crosshairs. It's not rational, it's not productive, but trauma and public persecution don't produce rational behavior. There's also emotional dysregulation linked to grief and substance use. Don Wells has acknowledged struggles with alcohol. Substance use, especially in the context of trauma, impairs judgment. It amplifies emotions. It makes people do things they wouldn't do sober, things they might regret later, things that look damning to outsiders but are really just the messy, ugly reality of someone barely holding it together. And then there's the psychological strain of living inside an unsolved case. Imagine waking up every day, knowing your child is gone, knowing people think you're responsible, knowing investigators are watching you, knowing the case is still open and you're still under scrutiny. That kind of pressure breaks people. It warps behavior. It makes you act in ways that don't align with how a grieving parent is supposed to act. But there is no supposed to. There's no manual for how to behave when your 5-year-old daughter vanishes and the world blames you for it. So the contradiction, Don Wells allegedly tearing down Summer's posters, can be explained without assuming guilt. It can be understood as the behavior of someone under unbearable stress, someone whose grief looks like anger, someone whose trauma has made him defensive and volatile. But here's the critical distinction. Behavioral data is not the same as evidentiary data. Contradiction signals stress, not necessarily guilt. Investigators know this. They're trained to separate behavior from evidence. They know that people under suspicion act strangely. They know that grief is unpredictable. They know that someone can behave in ways that look suspicious and still be innocent. But they also pay attention. Because behavior reveals pressure points. It reveals what someone is sensitive about, what they're trying to protect, what they're afraid of. And in an investigation, those pressure points matter, not because they prove guilt, but because they guide strategy. If Don Wells is innocent, his anger makes sense. It's the anger of a man who lost his daughter and then lost his reputation, his privacy, his peace. It's the anger of someone who's been accused without evidence, tried without a trial, convicted by people who know nothing about him except what they've read online. But if Don Wells is involved, if he knows something about what happened to Summer, his anger also makes sense. It's the anger of someone living with a secret, someone who knows the walls are closing in, someone who sees the missing person posters not as a tool to find his daughter, but as a reminder that people are still looking, still asking questions, still refusing to let this go. Investigators can't know which explanation is true based on behavior alone, but they can use behavior to inform their approach. They can use it to decide who to re-interview, what questions to ask, what pressure to apply. They can use it to build a psychological profile that helps them understand the dynamics at play in this case, and they can use it to evaluate credibility. Because people who are lying, people who are hiding something, often reveal themselves through contradictions. Not always, not definitively, but often enough that investigators have learned to watch for them. The poster incident, if it happened, is a contradiction. It doesn't fit the expected behavior of a grieving father desperate to find his child. But expected behavior is a construct. It's what we think people should do based on societal norms and media portrayals. Real people, especially people in crisis, don't follow scripts. So what does this mean for the investigation? It means Don Wells' behavior is part of the puzzle. Not the answer, but a piece. It's something investigators have noted, catalogued, and considered alongside everything else they know. It's a data point in a case built on hundreds of data points, none of them conclusive on their own, but all of them contributing to a larger picture. And here's the complexity we have to sit with. Don Wells can be angry, volatile, and contradictory, and still be innocent. Or he can be angry, volatile, and contradictory, and be guilty. Behavior alone doesn't tell us which. Only evidence does. The tension in this case, the reason it's so hard to parse, is that we don't have the evidence. We have behavior. We have suspicion. We have timelines that don't quite add up and statements that have been questioned. But we don't have proof. And without proof, all we can do is acknowledge the contradictions and resist the urge to fill in the blanks with assumptions. Investigators don't have that luxury. They have to follow every lead, evaluate every piece of information, and build a case that can withstand scrutiny in a courtroom. And part of that process is understanding the people involved, their behaviors, their motivations, their pressure points, not to convict them in the absence of evidence, but to guide the investigation toward the truth. Don Wells' behavior matters. But it's not the whole story. It's one thread in a case that involves dozens of threads, all of them tangled, all of them pulling in different directions. And until investigators can untangle them, until they can connect behavior to evidence and evidence to proof, the contradictions will remain just that. Contradictions, uncomfortable, unresolved, and impossible to ignore. The question that fueled anger, that ignited frustration across social media and true crime communities, was this: why doesn't Summer Wells have an FBI page like Sebastian Rogers? Sebastian Rogers, a teenager who went missing in Tennessee, had federal visibility. He had an FBI page. He had a federally announced reward. His case was amplified through national channels, shared widely, treated with the kind of urgency and resources that signal to the public that this case matters, that this child matters. Summer Wells had none of that. No FBI page, no federal reward, no national amplification. And to people watching, to people who cared about Summer, that disparity felt like a judgment. It felt like her life was valued less, like because of who her family was, where they lived, how they looked, she didn't warrant the same level of effort. The anger was real. The pain was real. And the question was valid. Why did these two cases, both involving missing children in Tennessee, both involving the FBI, look so completely different? Here's the hard truth, and it's one that doesn't sit comfortably. Visibility does not equal effort. Federal tools, the FBI page, the federal reward, the national media push, are deployed strategically, not equally. They're not a measure of how much investigators care. They're not a reflection of a child's worth. They're tactical decisions based on what investigators believe will be most effective in generating actionable information. In some cases, broad public engagement helps. In others, it doesn't. And the decision about which approach to take is based on the specifics of the case, the nature of the disappearance, the suspected circumstances, and the investigative strategy. So why did Summer's case stay quiet? Investigators believed the information they needed was concentrated, not dispersed. They believed the answers were likely to come from within a specific network of people, family, acquaintances, locals, not from a nationwide tip line. When you believe the key to solving a case is held by a small group of people, flooding the zone with public appeals doesn't help. It creates noise. It generates thousands of tips, most of them useless, that have to be evaluated, catalogued, and ruled out. It diverts resources away from the targeted work that's more likely to produce results. Public outreach, in a case like Summer's, could have made things worse. It could have amplified conspiracy theories. It could have driven witnesses underground, making them less likely to come forward because they're afraid of being targeted by online sleuths. It could have given suspects more information about what investigators know, allowing them to adjust their stories, destroy evidence, or coordinate with others involved. The case required precision, not publicity. And precision, by its nature, is quiet. It's methodical. It's invisible to everyone, except the people doing the work. The Van Hill Road clue proves the strategy worked. Years of quiet investigation Years of FBI-assisted analysis, years of building timelines and evaluating data and re-interviewing witnesses led to actionable intelligence. It led investigators to a specific location, 9.5 miles from where Summer disappeared, with enough confidence to justify an excavation. That didn't happen because of a tip called in from someone across the country who saw a poster. It happened because investigators followed a targeted approach, narrowed the focus, and built a case piece by piece. Silence wasn't neglect. It was discipline. It was the refusal to sacrifice long-term investigative success for short-term public reassurance. And as painful as that silence was, as much as it felt like abandonment, it was the strategy that brought investigators to Van Hill Road. Sebastian Rogers' case required a different approach. Maybe the circumstances of his disappearance suggested a broader suspect pool. Maybe there was reason to believe he could have been taken across state lines. Maybe investigators determined that public engagement would generate useful information. We don't know the specifics of why his case was handled the way it was. But the fact that it looked different from Summer's case doesn't mean one child mattered more than the other. It means the investigative strategies were different because the cases were different. This is the uncomfortable reality of how these decisions are made. They're not about fairness in the way the public defines fairness. They're about effectiveness. And effectiveness, in an investigation, is measured by results, not by visibility. The public wanted to see the FBI working Summer's case. They wanted the reassurance of federal branding, the signal that this case was a priority. And when they didn't get that, they assumed the worst. They assumed Summer had been forgotten. They assumed her case didn't matter. They were wrong. The FBI was working the case the entire time. Their analysts were reviewing data. Their specialists were consulting on strategy. Their resources were being deployed in ways that supported the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's efforts. But they were doing it quietly, behind the scenes, in a way that didn't generate headlines or satisfy the public's need for visible action. And now, with the Van Hill Road excavation, we can see the results of that work. We can see that the quiet approach, the targeted strategy, the decision to keep the case out of the national spotlight, led to something tangible, a clue, a lead, a step forward. It doesn't erase the pain of the silence. It doesn't make the years of waiting any easier for Summer's family or the community, but it does validate the strategy. It proves that investigators knew what they were doing, even when it looked like they were doing nothing. Do you think investigators made the right call keeping this case quiet? Or should they have gone public sooner? Let me know. No judgment, just curious. The comparison between Summer Wells and Sebastian Rogers will continue to haunt this case. It will continue to fuel questions about equity, about whose lives matter, about how decisions are made in the shadows of law enforcement agencies. And those questions are worth asking. They're worth sitting with, because the system isn't perfect. The decisions aren't always right, and the outcomes aren't always just. But in this case, the quiet strategy produced results. The FBI's invisible involvement, the decision to forego public-facing tools, the years of methodical work that no one could see, led investigators to Van Hill Road. And whatever was found there, whatever clue was recovered or confirmed, it happened because investigators chose precision over publicity. Summer Wells deserved visibility. She deserved a national platform. She deserved every resource the system could offer. But what she needed most was an investigation that could find the truth. And sometimes, finding the truth requires silence. It requires patience. It requires the kind of work that doesn't make headlines but builds cases. The strategy worked. The feds were always there. And the case, as quiet as it's been, is still moving forward. A clue changes everything, but it doesn't end the case. If anything, it intensifies it. Because now investigators have something concrete to work with, something to analyze, something to build on. The Van Hill Road excavation wasn't the conclusion of the Summer Wells investigation. It was a turning point, and what happens next, in the days and months and possibly years following that discovery, will determine whether this case ever reaches resolution. So what do investigators do after finding a clue like this? First, forensic analysis. If physical evidence was recovered, clothing, personal items, biological material, it goes to a lab. And not just any lab. In a case this high profile, with federal involvement, it's going to the best forensic specialists available. DNA testing, if applicable, takes time. Weeks, sometimes months, depending on the condition of the evidence and the complexity of the analysis. Soil samples have to be compared. Fibers have to be examined. Every piece of physical evidence has to be documented, tested, and evaluated for what it can tell investigators about what happened at Van Hill Road and how it connects to Summer's disappearance. Then there's cross-referencing. The clue doesn't exist in isolation. It has to be placed within the broader context of the investigation. Investigators will compare it against timelines they've built over the past 3 years. They'll look at witness statements to see if anyone mentioned Van Hill Road, if anyone placed a person or vehicle there around the time Summer disappeared. They'll evaluate suspects, known and unknown, to determine who had access to that location, who had opportunity, who had motive. This is where the FBI's analytical resources become critical. They have tools that can map relationships, identify patterns, and connect data points that might seem unrelated on the surface. They can take the Van Hill Road clue and run it through databases, compare it against other cases, and generate leads that local agencies might not have the capacity to develop on their own. Re-interviewing is inevitable. Anyone connected to Van Hill Road, whether through ownership, proximity, or past statements, is going to be spoken to again. And this time, investigators have leverage. They have a clue. They have evidence. And they can use that to apply pressure, to test stories, to see who changes their account and who sticks to it. People who were confident in their lies 3 years ago might not be so confident now. People who were loyal to someone might decide that loyalty isn't worth the risk anymore. And if the evidence supports it, investigators will start building a prosecutable case. That means working with prosecutors to determine what charges can be filed, what evidence is strong enough to present in court, what gaps still need to be filled. It means anticipating defense strategies, shoring up weaknesses, and making sure that when an arrest is made, if an arrest is made, the case is solid enough to result in a conviction. But here's the part that's hardest for the public to accept. The silence continues, and that's intentional. Public disclosure at this stage could destroy everything investigators have worked toward. If they announce what was found at Van Hill Road, they alert suspects. They give those suspects time to prepare, to destroy additional evidence, to coordinate stories, to flee. They compromise witnesses who might be cooperating quietly, putting those witnesses at risk and making them less likely to continue providing information. And they jeopardize prosecution by creating a public record that defense attorneys can use to challenge the integrity of the investigation. So investigators say nothing. They continue to issue the same vague statements. The investigation is ongoing. We are following leads. Anyone with information is encouraged to come forward. And the public, understandably, grows more frustrated with every non-answer. But the silence is protecting the case. It's protecting the possibility of justice. And as painful as it is, as much as it feels like we're being kept in the dark for no reason, the reason is clear. Disclosure could mean the difference between solving this case and losing it forever. The uncomfortable truth is that we may not know what the Van Hill Road clue means for months or even years. We may not know until there's an arrest. We may not know until there's a trial. We may not know until the case reaches a point where the information can be made public without compromising the outcome. And if the case never reaches that point, if the clue leads to more questions instead of answers, we may never know at all. That's the reality of living outside an investigation. We don't get real-time updates. We don't get to see the evidence. We don't get closure on the timeline we want. We get what investigators are willing to share when they're willing to share it, and sometimes that means we get nothing. But somewhere, someone knows what happened to Summer Wells. Maybe it's one person, maybe it's multiple people. Maybe it's someone who was directly involved, or someone who saw something, or someone who heard something and has been carrying that knowledge for 3 years. And if the Van Hill Road clue is as significant as it appears to be, investigators may be closing in on that person. Every piece of evidence narrows the field. Every re-interview applies pressure. Every day that passes is another day that someone living with a secret has to wonder if today is the day it all comes crashing down. And that pressure, invisible to the public but very real to the people under investigation, is part of the strategy. Investigators are patient. They're methodical. They're willing to wait as long as it takes to build a case that will hold up in court. Because rushing, because acting prematurely, because making an arrest before the evidence is strong enough could mean losing the case entirely. And losing the case means no justice for Summer, no accountability, no answers. So the work continues, quietly, carefully, out of public view, and the silence, as frustrating as it is a sign that the case is still active, still moving, still building towards something. The Van Hill Road clue changed everything. It proved the investigation was alive. It proved investigators were working, even when no one could see them. And it proved that the years of silence weren't emptiness. They were preparation. They were the foundation for whatever comes next. And what comes next, whether it's an arrest, a trial, or more waiting, will be determined by the evidence, by the work that's happening right now, behind closed doors, in forensic labs and interview rooms and strategy meetings. Work that we can't see, but that's happening nonetheless. Because this case isn't over, not by a long shot. And somewhere in the data, in the timelines, in the evidence recovered from Van Hill Road, there's a path to the truth. Investigators are walking that path, and every step brings them closer to answers that a little girl, and everyone who's been fighting for her, deserves. Missing child cases don't always look like what we see on TV. They don't follow the neat three-act structure of a crime drama where evidence is discovered, analyzed, and presented in court, all within an hour. They're messy, they're slow. They're filled with dead ends and false starts and years of work that produces nothing visible until suddenly, it does. Progress doesn't require press conferences. It doesn't require federal agents standing in front of cameras. It doesn't require daily updates or public reassurance. Progress happens in windowless offices where analysts review data. It happens in interview rooms where investigators ask the same questions in different ways, looking for inconsistencies. It happens in forensic labs where evidence is tested and retested. It happens in strategy meetings where prosecutors and investigators map out what they know, what they need, and how to get there. The FBI's involvement isn't always visible, but it's real. The Van Hill Road excavation proved that. Years of people asking where are the feds, years of assuming the FBI had walked away, and then investigators show up with excavators and federal resources, and a lead that could only have been developed through the kind of analytical work the FBI specializes in. They were there the whole time, working, supporting, providing the expertise and tools that state agencies needed to move the investigation forward. Silence can be strategy, not failure. This is the hardest lesson, the one that goes against every instinct we have as people who care about these cases. We want to know. We want updates. We want reassurance that someone is working, that the case hasn't been forgotten, that justice is still possible. But sometimes, the best way to achieve justice is to say nothing, to protect the investigation, to keep information internal where it can't be exploited or compromised, to prioritize the integrity of the case over the comfort of the public. The Van Hill Road excavation is proof of all of this, proof that the case never went cold, proof that investigators never gave up, proof that information was being developed all along, quietly, methodically, even when it looked like nothing was happening. For 3 years, the public saw silence and assumed abandonment. They saw the absence of FBI branding and assumed neglect. They saw no arrests and assumed failure. They were wrong on all counts. The investigation was alive. It was evolving. It was building towards something. And when investigators finally acted, when they showed up at Van Hill Road with heavy equipment and federal agents, it wasn't random. It wasn't desperation. It was the result of years of work finally producing something actionable. The lesson here, the one that applies not just to Summer Wells but to every missing child case that seems to go quiet, is this: trust the process, even when you can't see it. That doesn't mean blind faith. It doesn't mean accepting everything at face value or refusing to ask questions. It means understanding that investigations operate on a different timeline than public expectation. It means recognizing that visibility isn't the same as effort. It means accepting that sometimes the best thing investigators can do is say nothing. It's uncomfortable. It's frustrating. It requires patience that feels impossible when a child is missing, and every day without answers is another day of pain. But it's also the reality of how cases get solved, not through dramatic announcements and public spectacle, but through quiet, relentless work that accumulates over time until it reaches a tipping point. Summer Wells's case reached that tipping point at Van Hill Road. And whatever happens next, whether it's an arrest or more investigation or a resolution we can't yet imagine, it will be built on the foundation of work that no one saw, but that was happening all along. The case isn't over. The investigation continues. And somewhere in the evidence, in the data, in the information that's been developed over 3 years of invisible work, there are answers. Investigators are closer to those answers now than they've ever been. And the silence, as painful as it is protecting the path to justice. Trust the process, even when you can't see it, even when it feels like nothing is happening. Because in cases like this, the most important work is often the work no one knows about until it's done. Summer Wells is still missing. She was 5 years old when she disappeared. Blonde hair, blue eyes. A little girl who should be 8 years old now, starting 3rd grade, learning to ride a bike without training wheels, making friends, living the childhood that was stolen from her on June 15, 2021. Hawkins County, Tennessee, Ben Hill Road. That's where she was last seen, playing outside her home on a summer afternoon. And that's where the trail went cold, where the search began, where a family's life was shattered and a community was left with questions that still haven't been answered. The case remains open, active, ongoing. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation continues to lead the investigation, supported by federal resources, by analysts and specialists who've been working this case for 3 years. The FBI, invisible as they've been, remains involved. The work hasn't stopped, the search hasn't ended, and the Van Hill Road excavation proved that investigators are still building, still following leads, still moving toward answers. A clue has been found. We don't know what it is. We don't know what it means. We don't know if it will lead to an arrest or open up new questions or bring investigators closer to the truth. But it's there. It's real, and it represents years of work, years of patience, years of refusing to give up on a little girl who can't speak for herself. But the search isn't over, not even close, because a clue isn't closure, it's a step. And there are more steps to take, more evidence to analyze, more witnesses to interview, more work to be done before this case can be called solved. If you know something, if you saw something, if you heard something, even if it seems small or irrelevant or like it couldn't possibly matter, it might. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation has a tip line, 1-800-TBI-FIND. That's 1-800-824-3463. You can also submit tips online through their website. Every piece of information matters. Every detail, no matter how minor it seems, could be the piece that connects everything else, could be the piece that brings Summer home. Investigators can't do this alone. They need people to come forward. They need the community to stay engaged. They need anyone who knows anything about what happened on the 15th of June 2021, or in the days and weeks that followed, to find the courage to speak up. Because somewhere, someone knows. And that knowledge, that silence, is the only thing standing between Summer's family and the answers they've been waiting for. Summer Wells deserves to be found. She deserves justice. She deserves for the world to know what happened to her, who's responsible, and why a 5-year-old girl vanished from her own backyard and never came home. Her family deserves answers. They deserve to know whether to grieve or to hope. They deserve closure, whatever form that takes. And they deserve to know that the system didn't fail their daughter, that investigators did everything they could, that Summer mattered. And somewhere, in a file, in a lab, in someone's memory, there's a piece of this puzzle waiting to be placed. Maybe it's sitting in an evidence room right now, waiting for forensic results. Maybe it's in the mind of someone who's been too scared to come forward but is finally ready to talk. Maybe it's in a timeline that hasn't been fully understood yet, a connection that hasn't been made, a pattern that hasn't been recognized. The Van Hill Road excavation changed this case. It proved the investigation was alive. It proved investigators were working, even when no one could see them. It proved that silence wasn't abandonment. And it proved that after 3 years, there's still hope, still momentum, still a path forward. But it's not over. Not by a long shot. Summer Wells is still missing. And until she's found, until there are answers, until there's justice, the work continues. The investigation continues. And the refusal to forget, the determination to keep her story alive, to keep asking questions, to keep demanding accountability, that continues too. Because Summer Wells was a real little girl. She had a life. She had a family. She had a future that was taken from her. And she deserves for that to mean something. She deserves for her case to be solved. She deserves to be more than a headline, more than a true crime story, more than a mystery that fades into the background as the years go by. She deserves to be found, and somewhere in the work that's happening right now, in the evidence that's being analyzed, in the leads that are being followed, there's a path to making that happen. Don't let her be forgotten. Don't let this case fade. Don't let the silence, the frustration, the years of waiting convince you that it doesn't matter anymore. It matters. Summer matters. And every person who keeps her story alive, who shares her case, who refuses to move on until there are answers, is part of keeping the pressure on, keeping the investigation in the public eye, and keeping hope alive that one day there will be justice. If this video opened your eyes to how investigations really work, smash that like button and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear Summer's story. And most importantly, don't let her be forgotten. I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.